The Confederate States of America has a dark history, and the continuation of its ideologies long after the conclusion of the Civil War in 1865 cast a long shadow on much of the southern United States. Forced to relocate to the southern state of Lemoyne, the Van der Linde gang are beginning to be confronted with this dark history, and it's not over yet. We've got plenty more missions in the game's third chapter to go, so let's take a look at the real history of Red Dead Redemption 2. At the beginning of one of these missions, we get to meet Tavish Grey, the patriarch of the Grey family, who lovingly describes the warring Braithwaites.
Goddamn peasants! I don't know. Mongrels! Slave fuckers!
While I can't speak for the Braithwaites, such abuse often occurred. Owners could legally use their slaves as sexual objects, and would frequently do so, with men, women, boys, and girls. Slave owners would often perform or promote promiscuity in order to breed children, and about 13 to 15 years later, those children became an economic asset to the slave owner, to sell, put to work, or abuse yet again. And the stories get much darker than this. A dark shadow cast over America's recent history, a shadow that, outside of a few vague comments, doesn't really have much of a representation in Red Dead Redemption 2. But considering the subject matter, one can possibly see why. In this mission, Tavish Grey sends Arthur, John, and Javier out to steal some of the Braithwaite horses, and greatly exaggerates their worth.
These are prized horses I'm talking about. Them, they'll get you 5,000.
5,000 for horses.
John is right to be hesitant. Old nags around this time were sold for around $10, and decent riding horses usually cost between $120 and $185. There are stories of more expensive horses, from $200 to as much as $600 for one. And of course, in modern history, there are horses that have sold for millions of dollars, usually well-known race horses or descendants of some. But $5,000 for horses in 1899 is practically unheard of, and the game knows it.
Ain't no one round here got $5,000, boys, but nice meeting you.
At the end of the mission, Arthur recounts the experience in his journal.
At the end of it, we felt like prize idiots.
This isn't a term you really hear anymore, but it makes sense for Arthur to use it here, having first appeared in print as early as 1863 and throughout the 1870s. In one of the next missions, Arthur tells Charles about Dutch's relationship with the sheriff.
Soon as we laid eyes on that fool of a sheriff who runs that town, I knew Dutch was gonna play him like a fiddle.
This isn't the first time we've heard this phrase, but it has an interesting origin. The first known publication of the term is in June 1822, in a letter written by Mr. Robert Morgan to his brother John. Interesting names. In its full meaning, the term appears in 1846. A lady's heart is said to be like a fiddle because it is played on to the best advantage by a bow. Arthur and Charles look for Trelawney at his caravan in Rhodes. These portable homes began to appear in the UK in the 19th century. Drawn by horses and basic in design, the first luxury caravan was developed by Dr. William Stables in 1885. These types were typically considered luxurious and exclusively owned by the wealthy upper class, so it's no wonder that's how Trelawney wished to live. However, considering the somewhat run-down nature of the caravan and its surroundings, it appears that Trelawney's caravan has not been on the back of a horse in quite some time. Inside Trelawney's caravan, Arthur can find some hair pomade, though it's usually just referred to as pomade, since it's always used on hair. Soap was used as a type of pomade by some European tribes during the Roman era. In more modern history, pomades in the 18th century were exclusively used by gentry and mostly associated with the upper class. In the 19th century, bear fat was the main ingredient for pomade, and by the early 20th century, beeswax, lard, and petroleum jelly were also commonly used. Also in Trelawney's caravan, you might spot a razor. Several forms of razor, some resembling the straight razor as seen here, have been used for centuries. The first narrow-bladed folding straight razors were listed in 1680 by a manufacturer from Sheffield, England, and they became the primary method for manual shaving for more than 200 years, eventually being surpassed by the safety razor in the mid-20th century. Not too far from the razor is Trelawney's wood stove. The early history of these date back to at least the 1740s, when founding father Benjamin Franklin, prompted by a wood shortage in Philadelphia, attempted to improve the open hearth. He created the Franklin stove, a 3-sided iron box which used far less fuel but raised the temperature much quicker. While it did not gain much popularity at the time, subsequent designs drew from it. In the 1790s, Sir Benjamin Thompson designed a cooking device to scientifically control heat. Initially using bricks, later versions used cast iron for tops and doors, which led to an increase in production after the growth of the American coal and iron mining industries in the 1820s. Nearby to the wood stove too was a water pump. The rope and bucket technique for gathering water had been used for centuries. In 1849, however, the Gold's Manufacturing Company in New York was said to have cast the first all-iron pump. By the 1870s, cast iron pumps had become much more common, and they had several advantages. Namely, they were easy to use, and granted the ability to prevent water contamination by closing the top of the well. A fascinating invention, and nice to see it included here. In one of the next missions, Lenny tells Arthur about a lead.
These ignorant fools are weapon dealers. They have been selling weapons to Cuba and South America for years.
Interestingly, while not a group like the Lemoyne Raiders, there was one particular politician who would sell and smuggle ammunition and manpower to Cuba around this time. From 1905 to 1909, Napoleon Bonaparte Broward was the governor of Florida. About 10 years before he took office, Broward built a steamboat with his brother and an associate, and partnered with a prominent member of the local Cuban community to ship a load of military supplies and Cuban men back to Cuba to support their fight for independence from Spain. Having been 8 years old at the end of the Civil War, Broward wasn't exactly an ex-Confederate soldier like many of the Lemoyne Raiders, but he was a known racist and white supremacist, so they have that in common. Speaking of Lemoyne Raiders, Lenny tells Arthur about some of his troubles in the area.
We won't find no shortage of angry peckerwood idiots in the state of Lemoyne.
The word peckerwood, an inversion of the word woodpecker, is intended to be an offensive term towards white people, especially those living in poor rural areas. In this context, it apparently originated around 1859. In the 1920s, in contrast to the blackbird, African American folklore used the woodpecker to represent white people. Lenny's usage here, then, is completely accurate.
This is peckerwood country, all right.
Lenny tells Arthur about his treatment in the South, and by association, how Arthur would be treated.
Might call you a nigger lover. They see us riding like this.
He's right. Even in newspapers, this term was used quite frequently at the time.
But most of it is a glance or a word. And after that, a visit in the night.
Unfortunately, he's right about this too. In fact, 1899 appears to have been one of the worst years for African Americans around this time, with at least 185 lynchings on record for that year alone. Historian Rayford Logan considered the years 1877 to 1901 the lowest point for black people in America, citing the fact that most presidents in this time had essentially supported, promoted, and directly or indirectly allowed white supremacy, and that the media portrayal around this time had dehumanized and stereotyped African Americans. He also took opposition with Booker T. Washington's 1895 speech, what eventually became known as the Atlanta Compromise, which essentially agreed that Southern black people would submit to white political rule, tolerating discrimination, segregation, racist behavior, and not being allowed to vote, in exchange for being allowed a basic education instead of a more intellectual one. Essentially, when they weren't being murdered by the thousands, black people were being compromised, instead of simply being treated as equals. As Lenny and Arthur make their way closer to their destination, they come across a Civil War battlefield full of wrecked old weaponry and trenches. Trench warfare was actually utilized a bit during the Civil War, most notably during the sieges of Vicksburg in 1863 and Petersburg in 1864-65. At least in appearance alone, the Battle of Petersburg bears a striking resemblance to the battlefield in the game, so an inspiration there would be unsurprising. It should be noted that, in real life, battlefields would likely not have been preserved to a level like this by 1899. But of course, its existence in the game is meant to demonstrate history rather than replicate it, and it's likely based on similar battlefields seen in other popular media, so it's an understandable concession. If you visit this same battlefield during a stormy night, you'll hear the voices of those involved in the battle.
General Harris, sir, is everything all right, sir?
Specifically, you'll find out that Quincy T. Harris, the general who led the Confederacy in the fight, forced his men into a losing battle before he secretly escaped, despite claiming that it wasn't a retreat. Despite this apparent cowardice, Harris was later glorified as a hero of the Confederacy and a courageous commander in his battles. This is in line with the Lost Cause, an ideology that alters and ignores certain aspects of the Confederacy and its leaders to make them appear more heroic. One method of doing so is to blame their failures on their subordinates. For example, some Lost Cause authors believe that Lieutenant General James Longstreet is to blame for the Confederate loss at the Battle of Gettysburg, but it was actually Confederate General Robert E. Lee who ordered the disastrous Pickett's charge on the final day of the battle. In fact, Longstreet had opposed the assault and attempted to call it off, but considering Lee's status as an icon of the South and a hero of the Confederacy, someone else had to get the blame to make him appear stronger. Of course, the main destination in this mission is Shady Belle, the plantation house located in southern Lemoyne that the gang will become a little more familiar with later on. In appearance alone, Shady Belle bears a striking resemblance to the Southern Oaks plantation in New Orleans. Interestingly enough though, Southern Oaks was never a real plantation. It was built as a private residence in the mid-1960s, and since 1987 has been available as a wedding venue. In one of the next missions, Trelawney tells Arthur about his associates.
You know me, I like to make friends in low places.
You probably know this term from the popular Garth Brooks song from 1990, but the term itself comes from a lot earlier, at least August 1916 in one of its earliest publications. But of course, informal phrases like this usually far predate their first use in text. The phrase is a parody of the term friends in high places, referring to one having influential friends. This original phrase began as friends at court around the 1360s, and the exact quote began really being used in the 1800s. In this mission, Arthur robs a stagecoach with the help of a lockbreaker from Trelawney. From the invention of safety locks in the 1770s, many felt that their valuables were safe, but the locks unable to be properly opened without the key. The inventor of one of these locks, Joseph Bramah, placed one in the window of his shop in 1790 and offered a prize of £200 to whoever could pick or open it. For 67 years, the lock remained in place, until American locksmith Alfred Charles Hobbs finally opened it, after over 50 hours spread across more than 2 weeks, and thus no locks were safe. While Arthur robs the stagecoach, Trelawney distracts its passenger, Mrs. Chester Damson. We can find out a little more about Damson in the game's newspapers, and she appears to be based on Florence Foster Jenkins, a well-known singer and socialite who was often mocked for her poor singing ability. There are some subtle differences between the two, but the similarities are clear. Damson is a wealthy socialite and self-trained opera singer, while Jenkins was also wealthy but not self-trained. She took vocal lessons in New York. At this point in the game, Damson had somewhat recently travelled to New York City to sing on Broadway. Jenkins, meanwhile, only ever performed live once, at Carnegie Hall in New York City in October 1944, at the age of 76. Damson's performance is said to have received very mixed reviews. Similarly, Jenkins' final performance was met with strong negativity and sarcasm. Damson blamed the reviews on the orchestra and the vicious press. Jenkins, meanwhile, was devastated by the reviews. 5 days after the concert, she suffered a heart attack and died a month later. One of the mission names in this chapter references Sodom and Gomorrah, 2 biblical cities that were destroyed in the book of Genesis. On that note, at the end of this mission, Arthur gives his thanks to Mrs. Downs.
Thank you for your punctuality. It's next to godliness, isn't it?
That's cleanliness.
I'll have to take your word on that.
The proverb cleanliness is next to godliness, meaning that those who are pure are close to God, was first put forward in 1605 by Sir Francis Bacon, but the exact phrasing is best known from preacher John Wesley around the year 1791. As Arthur speaks to the young Downs, he delivers one of the game's best lines.
Maybe when your mother's finished mourning your father, I'll keep her in black, on your behalf.
The concept of wearing black at a funeral or in mourning appears to date back to the ancient Romans, who apparently wore black garments to mourn the death of loved ones. For a long time after this, white was actually preferred for mourning at funerals. However, after the death of Prince Albert in 1861, his widow Queen Victoria only wore black for the rest of her life. The British upper class aspired to be like her, and the trend remained. Other countries still sometimes wear other colours, though a lot of these countries continue to accept and wear black as well. The title of one of the next missions is also a reference to a biblical verse. We already heard about blessed are the meek from Matthew 5:5. Now we have blessed are the peacemakers from Matthew 5:9.
Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God.
Let's let Micah give that a go.
Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called...
Hey, Molly, where's Dutch?
Well, however it goes.
On the ride, Dutch talks about the promises of the United States.
The promise of this great nation. Men created equal. Liberty and justice for all.
The first part, men created equal, refers to a line from the United States Declaration of Independence, penned by Thomas Jefferson in 1776. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by the Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This line has often been considered the single phrase of the American Revolutionary period with the greatest continuing importance. The second part of what Dutch says, liberty and justice for all, is also a promise made for and by the American people. The preamble of the US Constitution, written and ratified in the late 1780s, refers to both liberty and justice. Dutch's verbatim usage, though, likely refers to the Pledge of Allegiance, the first version of which was drafted in 1892 by Reverend Francis Bellamy. I pledge allegiance to my flag and the republic for which it stands, one nation, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. This was first used in public schools in 1892, so fairly recent in regard to Dutch's usage here, but certainly not impossible. Towards the end of this mission, Arthur escapes from the O'Driscolls and, with the help of his horse, makes it back home. This isn't exactly historical, but it's fascinating. Horses typically can remember their way back home. It appears that they use two methods to do this. The first one is mind mapping, where, once they're familiar with their surroundings, they use visual landmarks and scent mapping to get their bearings and find their way home. The second method, when unfamiliar with their surroundings, is compass orientation. It's believed that horses are able to tap into the Earth's magnetic fields and use them to navigate their way home. So Arthur's half-conscious ride back to camp actually has some accuracy to it, and he has a lot to thank his horse for. In one of the chapter's last missions, as Arthur and Micah fight back against the entire town of Rhodes, one of their attackers yells something.
Into those sons of bitches!
Now the term broadside originally referred to the entire side of a ship above the water where the guns were placed. It later became used to refer to the actual firing of the guns. On land then, it probably came to be used as a synonym for attack or fire upon. Once most of the town is dead, Arthur and Micah confront Sheriff Grey, who also says something of note.
Who do you think you are? Bunch of two-bit thugs from God knows where?
A bit in the United States is equal to 12.5 cents, so 2 bits is a quarter, as it was known in the 1790s. The term 2 bits became well known from the call and response shave and a haircut, first recorded in 1899. Its meaning of cheap and tawdry is first recorded in 1929, but of course as a colloquial insult its usage likely far predates its first recording. With the town dead and the trio ready to depart, Micah can't help but use his favourite nickname for Arthur.
Okay, cowpoke.
This term apparently dates back to around 20 years before the game, originally used to refer to cowboys who use long poles to poke cattle onto railroad cars. The Low Honor version of Arthur's post-mission journal entry directly mentions the town's gold, or lack thereof.
Still no Confederate gold.
The term Confederate gold was used to refer to hidden reserves of gold that got lost after the Civil War. Millions of dollars worth of gold went unaccounted for. According to the stories, with the Union troops hot on their tails in New Orleans, the Confederates allegedly moved millions of dollars of gold to Columbus, Georgia, a safer place. It was temporarily stored at the Iron Bank, and General P.G.T. Beauregard was ordered to take it in October 1862. According to Beauregard's biography, what became of that coin is a mystery. What we do know at least is that the Confederate States Secretary of the Treasury for the final years of the war, George Trenholm, was arrested after the war ended and accused of stealing millions of dollars in Confederate assets. In one of the game's best missions, the gang launch an assault on Braithwaite Manor. Inside the manor are a few things of note, like the stove, which is pretty accurate in appearance to real 19th century stoves. There's also a clock within a mantelpiece. Mantel clocks began being mass-produced by Eli Terry in Connecticut in the early 19th century, and they were popularized by Simon Willard, creator of the banjo clock, in Massachusetts. Willard designed the Simon Willard shelf clock, which is highly collectible today. Upstairs in the manor, Catherine Braithwaite possesses a perfume bottle with the vintage atomizer. Around the year 1880, nose and throat specialist Dr. Alan de Vilbus developed a medicated oil to be sprayed into the throat, as well as an atomizer to spray it. In 1890, he established a company to produce medical atomizers in Ohio, but it wasn't until 1907 that his son introduced perfumizers, a way to use the atomizer to spray perfume, affordably priced at $1.25. So unless Catherine Braithwaite is actually using this device to spray medication into her throat, I'm not sure why she has it in her house. In the last mission of Chapter 3, the gang is visited by the Pinkertons, and John tells them his real name.
And who are you?
Rip Van Winkle.
Now, Rip Van Winkle is actually the name of a short story written by Washington Irving and first published in 1819. It follows a man named Rip Van Winkle, who falls asleep in the Catskill Mountains and awakes 20 years later to a completely different world, having missed the entirety of the American Revolution. Considering Agent Milton's likely privileged upbringing compared to John's, it's interesting that Marston knows the story while Milton clearly does not, but it's certainly not inaccurate. Milton updates Dutch and the gang on the state of the country.
We didn't kill all them savages only to allow the likes of you to act like human dignity, and basic decency was outmoded or not yet invented.
Of course, by kill all them savages, he's likely eloquently referring to the American Indian Wars, a series of several conflicts that ultimately lasted over 300 years, and with the help of diseases brought to the country through colonization, decreased the indigenous population in the Americas by more than 80% by 1900. And by up to 98% in some areas. Of course, in this mission, the gang moved camp to Shady Belle, the old plantation house that we visited earlier, and they wouldn't be the only gang to do so. In 1879, the James gang robbed 2 stores before finding shelter in abandoned cabins on the property of the Kemp plantation in Louisiana. The Vanderlyn gang are a little more luxurious then, living in the main property itself. After the gang arrives, Arthur and Dutch go for a ride.
Where are we going? To take a look at this 8th wonder of the civilized world, Saint Denis, I keep hearing about.
There are several different lists of wonders of the world, but the most well-known one is likely the 7 wonders of the ancient world, dating back thousands of years. This so-called 8th wonder is an unofficial title that has been given to many different locations around the world, though Dutch's usage here is more likely an overinflation of the importance of Saint Denis based on stories he's heard about the city. As the two get closer to Saint Denis, Dutch discusses his ideas for the future.
I think we need to move a little further. Put some ocean between us and all of this.
We'll certainly hear some elaboration about this later on, but it's interesting that Dutch brings it up here. He wouldn't be the only one to have this idea either. Around 1899, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid began making plans to leave the United States. They ultimately made the move in 1901, using the $30,000 they had inherited from Butch's uncle. And of course, by uncle, I mean the National Bank of Winnemucca, Nevada. And by inherited, I mean stolen at gunpoint. But the point still stands, and it's fascinating to have yet another connection between Butch and Dutch. The town of Rhodes is rich with history about the Confederate States, the impacts of abolition, and the treatment of slaves. While it ultimately takes a fairly surface-level analysis of these events, simply their inclusion in the game, the attempt to inform players about the history of the southern United States, is commendable. But while the Van der Linde gang may be done with Rhodes, they're not completely done with the southern United States. We now enter the city of Saint Denis, another location rich with history, and the historical connections don't get any less interesting.